Great to be here having this conversation with you guys today about will net zero regulations save nature. We are going to lay out the terms, make sure we're all singing from the same song sheet about what we mean by those things, share some of the case studies that Abby and I are both experiencing in the work that we're currently doing, and then we're going to get over those tables and get into these questions, the different parts of this question in groups, so we have a chance to talk, meet each other. There's a lot of great quality in the room, lots of people with lots of great experiences who could equally be up here convening this session. So just to try and get the thing moving, get us on the same page, and then get to the good stuff, which is what ideas can we come up with, come around, and maybe new projects might even form from this session. So thanks very much for joining us. And so, net zero regulation, will it save nature? Obviously, I don't want to bore anyone or waste anyone's time, but just for the sake of making sure we're all on the same song sheet, net zero, we don't want to release more carbon into the atmosphere. We want to get that as close to zero as we can. The net part is that we have to do some release of carbon in producing things. What can we do to make sure we take responsibility for that and draw down other bits of carbon to get to net zero? Regulation doesn't need much explaining. What are the rules that are forcing us to change our behaviors on different levels, from different levels of governance? And then saving nature, that the question of actually, is this narrative of net zero and this set of policies actually competent enough to do the thing that we need it to do, which is to save the environment that we live in and love? So to start at the end and go to the beginning, Abby, what is it that got you calibrated in your relationship with nature and turned you on to nature in the first place?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining on Friday at 3 to talk about regulation. It's my world, so I know why I'm here, but it's really great to see so many people also jumping in on this. So my whole journey actually started because my mum went and lived with the Huaorani tribe in Ecuador when I was 16. And then when she came back, they said the Huaorani are losing their land. The Amazon is going to be drilled for oil. And as a 16-year-old, I just didn't make sense of this at all. And then we did this big campaign, and we managed to convince the international community to pay the Ecuadorian government to keep the oil in the ground. And it lasted for many years, only to be drilled for oil many years later. But that just started that cascade effect of just years and years and years, spending my whole life looking at how can I support businesses to have a better impact on the planet and society. And that's what led to my current adventure, which is Compare Ethics. So what we do is we verify how sustainable supply chains are and then accurately communicate that to investors and consumers. So that's my journey in a nutshell, for context on this space and how I've been working in it.
And my path was a little bit later. After doing business for 10 years in advertising and then in the giving space, in the charity space, I then went to live in the woods off-grid for a year and did nothing other than sit there, make fires, and started to make YouTube videos and look at the trees and the flowers and see the seasons. And from there, that's where my relationship with nature really shifted about 5 years ago. So to get into net zero for you, you're obviously now with Compare Ethics looking at sustainability at large, and as opposed to us with our carbon, where we really are drilled down on net zero accounting and accountability. How does net zero feature for you when you're working with these large companies, thinking from the top down with regulatory frameworks? How does it factor for you? Is it a big topic at the moment? Has it changed in the last year or two?
I think it is fundamentally shifting due to a massive increase in standardisation. So whereas previously I would say that the environmental, social and governance space was more aspirational, it's just something that we'd like to do, we're really seeing the market shift into how do we measure, what does good look like? And I think that is a really key element of this shift. Alongside that, you have the policy narrative, which is where the net zero, the 1.5 emissions has really come from, which is actually more of a global policy narrative that's now trickled into relevant markets, whether you're Burberry or any other, PLC, everyone's now looking to use that policy framework as a benchmark, where there is a lot of focus is around the whole environmental, social and governance, of which net zero is clearly that one key pillar within the environmental. And today we're not going to be able to go into all of the depths of net zero or ESG because we would be here all night. We'd probably need some drinks at some point. But that today, I think it's definitely key to kind of lean in on how businesses are seeing that net zero element. And I think the most important thing for them is they're trying to work backwards from these very large commitments that they've put out and work out how do we get there? What are the systems and data that we need? And I think, that's going to be a really key thing for us to talk about today in order for us to answer the homework question, which is this good enough,
I think there is actually a rum tasting thing later this evening, so there might be an answer for that. But in my world, I deal with small UK businesses that are responding to the net zero narrative out of passion. They're not required to do it. The only sort of regulatory or framework at all that they're trying to adhere to is the GHG protocol through the ISO standard. And so we don't directly have to bump up against that framework, but your work is driven because of what's coming down the pipe. So I'm fascinated today to learn from you about higher up the food chain. What are the regulatory frameworks that are beginning to press down on people at the businesses that you're dealing with? Like an example or two would be amazing for me.
Yeah, so I think we'll start at the very, very highest point, which is around the Task Force for Climate Disclosures. And that is a really key regulation that is being adopted as a mandatory set of requirements in multiple markets, notably the UK and the US most recently, but others as well. And I think that actually, do you know what's so interesting about this is requiring businesses to really look at their data, look at how their climate exposure and risks are being managed. A part of that is, how their products and supply chain, which no one really talks about, which is definitely something that I'd like to dive into more. But importantly, for example, take a multi-brand retailer PLC, right? Their value chain is a lot of SMEs. So whilst today the market is looking at mandatory disclosures and getting better data for ESG for PLCs today, that will actually ultimately trickle down into the SME market. And I think it's going to be really interesting because that is ultimately being set this year as a task force group around those standards. But there is a bunch of other corresponding requirements that businesses are also having to grapple with. So I spend a lot of my time working with the Competition and Markets Authority on their Green Claims Code. And again, this is something that's going on in conversation across C-suites, across the big PLCs at the moment, which is how are we making sure that we're not misleading our customers and our stakeholders. And then you naturally have the European Union's Green Deal, which we will definitely need some more drinks for that one before we dive into that. But that one is going to be really interesting because the core proposal there is looking at the concept of a product passport, where businesses will have to make sure that there's a passport for their products around the environmental claims, and that any data on the environmental or social claims of that product is verifiable. And that's going to be super interesting. How is the UK going to converge or diverge with that? I mean, we've seen largely on the anti-greenwashing regulations a lot of convergence and standardisation, which we can dive into in more detail, but that's just a few top tier there, high level of how this regulation space is shifting in order to meet net zero. And this is creating a huge compliance burden for business, but actually a really huge opportunity to get this right and capture more market share.
I'm genuinely interested in the answer to this because the only dealing I've had with the Competition Markets Authority is when I spoke to them last year. I don't know if any of you have seen the Shell Drive Carbon Neutral campaign. It's still running in my local petrol station right now. It's been running for 2 years. And about 18 months ago, I got the absolute hump with it. I was thinking, this is an actual, and excuse my French, but an actual piss take that I'm sitting here, and admittedly, I'm completely complicit in it because I'm still using it. But in my hybrid car, I'm still pumping petrol in, but on the cap it says drive carbon neutral. And I looked deep dived into how are they saying that? And I spoke to the CCC, I spoke to the CMA, I spoke to the ASA. I feel like I'm doing like an Eminem rap tune or something. I spoke to all three of those government organizations trying to say there is no accountability here. There's no way it's true. They've promised well-to-wheel accountability for the emissions. So even the emissions of you driving it, not just the emissions to get it to you. And I did the calculations, and the cost is about £100 million a year that they owe the public. And so that's 200 million just in the UK, and they've been doing it in the Netherlands as well. When I called the CMA, my point is, they really didn't have any interest in what I was saying. They felt like it was somebody else's responsibility because they didn't feel responsible for doing the carbon mathematics themselves. I guess my question at the bottom of that experience, as you can tell I'm still quite passionate about it, is do regulations, do these bodies actually have teeth? Do they have the ability to make a difference? And have you seen it where it has made a difference?
Yeah, I think the market has shifted really quickly. You know, going from, if you think about it, when I was saying at the beginning, the aspiration versus measurement, like this is moving actually at pace. You know, today, the CMA Greens Claims Code requires you to have considered a clear life cycle assessment of that product. It needs to be a sound, reputable methodology. All the science needs to be, you know, undebatable and, you know, and not, you know, highly contested areas of science. You need to have credible data behind every single environmental claim. You need to have really specific claims. You know, I'm just reading off some of the things that the CMA today are saying businesses must do. And that has already seen, you know, since it's been enforced in January, Oatly, I don't know if anyone saw Oatly get investigated by the advertising standards. You have the same across multiple European markets. Adidas were investigated in France. The Netherlands have set out their own consumer codes on this, 900,000 euros in fines or a percentage of revenue. The US, who currently haven't updated their consumer protection code on this, just gave Walmart a $5 million fine on this particular topic for not having the right data and life cycle assessment. So those types of claims are soon to be no more. What we're now seeing, whether you're in the retail vertical, I mean, one of our customers is McCann, the global ad agency, whatever vertical you are in, we almost have found the opposite now happening, where there's a green hushing going on. So the concept of where people now don't want to say anything because they're too scared to. I think one of the high street retailers down the road from here took down all of their labels and claims. So businesses are really finding themselves rocking in a hard place, and they're looking for solutions to help them get back on that right agenda because they know there's a big market for it.
I guess a practical example then will be if this new thing just came in January, the Green
Claims Code, yeah.
Exactly. I wonder if that has actually made a difference to what Shell has to say on their campaign, for example, because when I looked at it, which was, as I said, about a year ago, there were no links to any evidence or any data. They are just broad claims that then are left there, which was my issue with it. And I wonder if they've been forced to change. And then the next real question, the teeth question is, but what if they haven't? You know, does the CMA actually have the ability to sue people, take them to court? Is there a way, you know, does it have teeth at the bottom of it?
It does. The CMA haven't outwardly said that they are doing the same thing as, say, the Netherlands, but consumers can take the brands to court, and you know they will do legal enforcement where relevant. At the moment, the CMA have focused their investigation on the fashion industry, so they will publish a kind of a naughty list of all the current businesses who are not currently complying with the rules. So that probe is actively going on at the moment. But every consumer vertical will be, integrated as part of this assessment. I think most of the complaints as part of the consultation, from what I saw, was clearly to do with the apparel sector. But naturally, all of these other energy verticals, you name it, will all have their day, their time. And so I suspect that what we'll see is enforcement happen on the apparel vertical, but you'll see lots of other verticals move quite quickly, and that's just for the UK, let alone all the other markets we talked about.
I guess the other thing that's worth talking about in the context of net zero regulation is timing and temporality. What is good now may not be good in 5 years' time. 2050 is not the same as 2030. Obviously, we've got the government's current policies for 2050, that everybody needs to be net zero. And then I've also seen in the ICAEW, the Chartered Accountant side, so from the carbon accounting side, will accountants save the world kind of narrative, that in the next 3 years, they're looking to have a far wider set of requirement. I guess the question is, are we on the right timeline with this narrative? Is net zero a good narrative, and is it the right timeline, and can that be enforced? And that question, I guess, is still open for me about whether whether there's the teeth behind it to get us there in time.
Yeah, I think it's less clear from a UK perspective than it was potentially even 6 months ago how the regulators will continue on this journey. I'm not sure there's quite the political bandwidth, putting it delicately. However, on the European front, I think that's really where you're going to see a lot more movement. Just let's take the social side. I know we're staying on net zero, but just to give a flavour, it's mandatory for products to have certain materials to make claims on environmental claims. This year, next year, you have mandatory due diligence regulation that's requiring proof of, safe working environments and things like that. And that's just getting started. So I think what we'll see is Europe will ultimately lead on this high bar of standardisation on how we get to net zero via a regulatory framework. But I think that largely the UK will converge, I suspect, but it really depends in this world. I don't want to predict too far in the future because everything is a possibility at this point. I think the only final thing to say is on the timelines is it's interesting that everyone has their own timeline, and even the PLC set their own timeline in a lot of cases. Science-based targets are really fantastic mechanisms because I think they're very, very focused on good, better data standards, more reliable, but there is still a lot of variation on how businesses are looking to meet them and by what time frame. Burberry wants to be I was literally at an event with Burberry yesterday, so that's why they're top of my mind. They want to be climate positive by 2040. Someone else might have a different aspiration. And I think the interesting part is the same with the leadership in democracies, and people might have heard this before, but if you have different leaders or different CEOs on a tenure within a certain amount of time of business or political, functions, they're not necessarily incentivized for the 2040 framework. They'll do their bit and then they're handing over the baton to someone else. And I think there needs to be a lot more accountability, and I think other elements like linking executive pay might be a great mitigation for those types of things, but there is still a lot to do to make sure that we have the right systems and frameworks both in business and regulatory side to align on that.
And before we go on to thinking about what it means to save nature and whether indeed that's a good way to frame it to start with, I'm just curious, in your line of work where companies come into you and they need to sort of get compliant with regulation, and there's a whole bunch of different themes and narratives by which somebody could contemplate, are we doing enough good? In that battle of the stories of what does it mean to do good, whether we're talking about, supply chain, whether we're talking about fair trade, whether we're talking about, our relationship with nature, are you seeing an increase in focus on carbon and net zero, or is that getting surpassed by other themes? And where is it actually at from, let's say, a couple of years ago?
I think it's really interesting. For a lot of the teams that we talk to, they're in a pressure cooker. So let's take sustainability teams as a great example of this. They've got TCFD reporting requirements. They have green claims requirements. Their consumers are sending in data requests. Their employees are not going to work at a company very long that aren't actively moving the needle on it. And I think what we're really seeing is companies ultimately not actually having the right capacity internally. The World Economic Forum and BCG put out an excellent report at the start of the year, which really signalled that in order for us to reach net zero, we need to be building in capacity within businesses. And so where we support is actually helping them make sense of that data quickly, helping them actually operationalize some of these data requests, either for other internal stakeholders or external. And I think that's just one element of a much larger problem that businesses are having, which is a lot of the time this is the first time anyone's done TCFD reporting or anyone's complied with the Green Claims Code. So they're also looking for support, they're looking for advice. People have just started. Most of where the market is today is everyone is just getting their head around it. There's still a long way to go for this to be scaled up and business as usual.
Is there an area of regulation that you are interfacing with on behalf of your clients that you wish were stronger, had better teeth, or indeed was stepped back from because it's producing an unhelpful set of behaviours?
I think One of the most interesting ones, I am so glad the Green Claims Code existed. I started the business about 6 months before the Green Claims Code started, so for us it was a great win. But I think we need to be really careful about when we're setting regulation around the unintended consequences of that. So there's a really good case in point. In the Green Claims Code, you're requiring your manufacturers to pass you certifications data. Is it organic? Is it recycled? However, if you don't have a large percentage share of that manufacturer base, you can be still a very multi-million pound business, but if you only represent 1% of that manufacturer, you're not getting that data as quickly as the competitor who owns about 70% of that manufacturer. So we need to make sure that it's mandatory for data to be shared to really truly create a mandatory, a level playing field, which is what the regulations set out to do. And so that's a good example of where regulation is important. We're doing a really good job starting there and everything else, but we need to think about the unintended consequences of this very complex system that we're in and how that, tips markets, moves markets, because ultimately data will become the most valuable asset to make claims, and good data, even more so. Yeah.
From our perspective on the grassroots side, we saw a massive spike since COP26 where the demand for, let's say, more innovative carbon capture solutions, so beyond just a standard credit that you could purchase from the CBL marketplace or something like that, it's really spiked. So a lot of people, small companies, I think for the reason of the narrative moving forwards and getting to net neutral or net negative wasn't a strong enough story to get credit with their communities and their customers anymore. They wanted to say, well, we're doing that, but we're also investing in biochar or in blue carbon in kelp forests, or what else did we help with? A couple of other things that were similar to that as well. They're willing to pay it's a phenomenal market force that I've never seen before, where people have been willing to pay a significant premium, like 2 or 3x on what they would pay for let's say, a more standard afforestation credit, because they want to be seen as part of the innovative future. Which, if you think about it, it's actually a very peculiar premium they're willing to pay. It's almost philanthropy baked into their ESG strategy, but it's been amazing to be able to do that and see that moving forward, so we can start investing in more interesting projects that have the potential to unlock a greater rate of change in our protection of nature. Which leads me on to the final part of this conversation before we then break off into tables and start getting more practical, because this is the solution circle and we want to get it into a circle, and we want to start getting practical, see what new ideas and new projects might even emerge from today's session. But the whole save nature piece, obviously there's at the very start of that, saving nature. Does it really need saving, or is it just that our version of nature needs saving? But there's real questions about, are we looking at the right attribute of nature? There's so many parts to nature that we need. In our work, we look at 4 different qualities in land projects. What's happening with carbon capture, what's happening with soil quality, biodiversity, and how many calories, specifically proteins, are being produced from this land. We're seeing the Environmental Act in November last year come in, requiring new building projects to show 10% biodiversity net gain. I know, because I'm dealing with it every day at the moment, trying to measure biodiversity net gain on land projects is infinitely more complex than trying to measure the amount of carbon getting sequestered by soil or trees. And how you then turn that ecology into some form of economy that people can then sort of purchase the unit of and say, we did this bit of this emergent process, the product of an emergent process that's led to some new species coming back, is incredibly difficult. So there's a question here of, even if we're successful with the narrative of net zero, and we're successful with all the regulation that goes behind it, and it has the right teeth, is it really going to save nature at the end of the day? And I guess in your broader context of thinking about sustainability, not just the simple focus I've got, what other where are the limits of the narrative that we're working with here, and what other parts are necessary for those that, like maybe like my clients, that some of which are only thinking about net zero. What other aspects should we be considering here to make sure that we're not getting our blinkers on too much?
Yeah, I think it's such a good question. I think that what is really interesting about what you said was almost like, what's the role of innovation within this space, and what are the regulatory frameworks in order for us to be able to innovate? Because if we don't have the right capacity of frameworks to be able to say that that approach that you're taking under that element is, if that's debated as contested in some way, it's really hard for businesses to know what to invest in, and it's really hard for regulators too. So I think we need to strike the right balance for this to work. We need really detailed guidance on how we get to standardization as part of this process. I think that's going to be really key. I think the nature part is so fundamental to this whole conversation. We have 9 planetary boundaries, of which carbon is one aspect. And it's really interesting to see now how we can start looking at the intersection between these really core planetary boundaries to get to a wider narrative output. But I think ultimately we have to be advisors. Everyone here today, it's probably, as I say, to be here at 3 on a Friday to talk about regulation, everyone has that role. Share that data with the CMA that you're working on, whatever it is, whatever challenges that you're seeing in the market. I think it's our duty to make sure that as this field emerges and standardises, that we give the regulators the best information possible, because otherwise bad regulation will just make the situation worse, and we're not ever going to have a chance to really stop the impact that we're having on nature in the way that we are. So hopefully that answers your question. That last one was a very tough one to end on. But yeah, I'm keen to see what everyone else is working on, and some ideas that you guys might have had on the back of some of these areas that we've talked about.
Thanks, Abby. So we are going to move into the second part of this session. We've got 3 tables over here on the right-hand side, where we are going to break down this question into the 3 main parts: the narrative of net zero itself, the regulatory frameworks that's coming down, what are the good ones we've seen, what ones do we need next, and our relationship with nature itself. And we are going to rotate at least around 2 of those. And so this is a chance for us to get to know each other, hear each other's views, and crucially, going to bring it back together at the end, hear from each of the tables, and try to pull together the stories that are coming out, ideas that are coming out, and see if we can get somewhere new. That's what makes this either a talking shop like any other session you could go to, where a couple of people get up and tell the stories that they have from being in the space, which any of us could do, versus it being something incredibly valuable, which is emergent things coming out of this room that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And that's what makes me excited, and that's why I'm here. So without any further ado, I suggest so Abby, if you'd be kind enough to go and be on the middle table, which will be where we'll be thinking a bit about regulation. Alicia, where are you at the back? If you wouldn't mind joining the nature-y table, and I'll sit on this table. It'll take about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how we get on. Just take a peruse, take a little walk, grab a glass of water, find yourself in a minute or so at one of those tables, and we'll get cracking. We'll see where it takes us, and look forward to seeing what happens once we rotate and bring it back here at the end. Thank you.